Well, no one could have predicted this confluence of events just a few months ago, beginning with COVID-19, the ensuing economic crisis, and then the death of George Floyd, and now the seismic street protests that are driving a sea change in public consciousness. And CEOs across the corporate landscape have added their voices to the discussion and are determined to use their influence in order to make lasting change. And corporations are in a unique position here, and indeed are often expected to address issues of racial injustice and social unrest. For over 100 years, the Conference Board has been helping the world's leading companies and society at large navigate crises and develop reasoned solutions for our country. The Conference Board was founded amid labor unrest in 1916, and this led to the adoption of workplace safety reforms, compulsory health insurance, and the 8-hour workday. We were at the forefront of conversations regarding opening the workplace to women and people of color and people with disabilities. Our policy center is the Committee for Economic Development, which helped shape the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II and helped form the Jobs Act of 1946, which set forth workplace reforms that are meaningful still today. So our tradition has been a long one and continues today with our efforts to shape public policy that impacts our workplace, communities, and governments. Given these events, we are launching a series of CEO forums to foster action. They are entitled Building a More Civil and Just Society. This series will feature CEOs across American industry, CEOs who have been leaders in social areas and that will help shape the future of our country. And I've asked some of the most influential people to share their voices, their experiences, and their viewpoints. I'm very happy that Ron Williams has joined us today. Ron is the former chairman and CEO of Aetna. He's currently the chairman of RW2, where he counsels C-suite corporate executives on the development of strategy. He was a member for a long time of the healthcare industry, including his work at WellPoint, where he served as group president and company's Blue Cross division. He's a director of American Express, Boeing, Johnson & Johnson. He serves as a operating advisor to the private equity firm of Clayton, Dubilier & Rice, and manages several portfolio companies there. Ron, your bio goes on, but we are so happy that you have joined us today, and welcome.
Steve, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. I've long been a supporter of the Conference Board, and I believe now is an opportune time for the Conference Board to assume its historic leadership position in helping corporations find their way through a set of very challenging issues. I think the year started off with a good economic situation. This was the best economy I have seen in my career. And all of a sudden, we found ourselves with the absolute worst economy I have ever seen. And I think companies and people were struggling with that health pandemic. And then all of a sudden, on top of that, we've had a series of incidents which have illustrated the issue of the police violence, social injustice in the context that people are not all treated fairly and equitably. And I think it's clear that corporations have a lot more to do in the area of social justice as well as diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. But so given these events that we've all seen play across our newspapers and television screens following the death of George Floyd, how would you characterize the social state of our nation today?
Well, I think the nation is really confronting something that has been longstanding. And I think there's a general awareness that we are seeing among the broader population. You know, historically, the civil rights movement was really a movement driven by a combination of the Black or African American community with liberal progressive members of the broader community who really saw the injustices. Now what we're seeing is a much broader coalition of people who really understand where we are and what we need to do. And I think that is really quite encouraging to me, both as an executive. I think there's a huge opportunity for talent. You know, I am one of 20 people who is African American who's been a CEO of a major company. And I can tell you, I'm good, but I'm not that good to be only one of 20. That there's an enormous amount of human capital that is being wasted because we're not giving people the opportunity to demonstrate the impact they can have on business and our society.
No, you know, you make an excellent point. I really do believe, and it feels like this coalition of people who are standing up and rising up is much broader than it has been before. People from all walks of life, people from, you know, both sides of the political aisle, people, you know, men, women, people of color. It really feels great to see, you know, sort of a consensus begin to form. But, you know, these issues are not new. You know, we watched it, you and I are old enough to have watched the 60s and all of the things that happened there. And I don't know about you, but I felt like, gee, once we got through that, this is going to be it. We're really going to see lasting change. And then, of course, you know, these things seem to just keep reoccurring. Is this time any different, Ron? I mean, are we going to see lasting positive change from everything that's going on today?
Well, I'm an optimist, and I have to be. And I think that what's different this time is really video. I think that many of the things that people have reported over and over and over again were not recorded on video. And so it was easy to say, well, you're too sensitive. You know, I'm not really sure that's what happened. But when you see the kinds of things that happened with George Floyd, when you see the kinds of things that happened in Central Park with the woman who basically was calling the police on someone who simply asked her to leash her dog in an area where that was required, the average person can see that there is a level of behavior and a level of lack of fair play that has dire consequences. You know, the way I try to describe it is when you're an African-American male and you have an interaction with the police, you don't know if this is one of the thousands of good policemen who are going to treat you fairly and equitably and judge you by your actions and what you've done, or whether you are dealing with someone who is the equivalent of an IED and who may result in an enormous explosion that can have dire consequences for you. That's a risk you don't run. It's a risk my son runs. And it's a risk that I think people are now understanding. Most police are great. They do a terrific job. It's not a job that I would want to do. And we owe them a huge debt of gratitude. But I think the video is what's different. It brings the reality to people. I think the pandemic is different because it's demonstrated to us that the most vulnerable in our society, those who are low income, low wages, primarily people of color in many communities, are in fact experiencing much higher death rates and impact rates. And it's due to the disparities in healthcare and the quality of healthcare services people receive rather.
Yeah, and you know, so it's the video and it's also the internet and the ubiquitousness of this. You know, I think a lot of people kind of view these as, gee, this rarely happens. You know, what we're watching is terrible, but it's really rare. And now we're beginning to learn that it's not as rare as everybody wishes and you know, thought it was. Can you share any personal experiences? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you know, anything that you can share with us, you know, as personally that you've experienced in society, and examples that have affected you.
Well, yes, I think I don't want to trivialize the death of George Floyd, but I think there are experiences that many executives have had. You have to understand when people know you and they know the kind of accomplishments you've had, you're treated one way. The minute you leave that environment and you go out, you're just another African-American male in the community. For example, the number of times someone has pulled up in front of a restaurant where I was standing outside and handed me the keys because they thought I was a parking lot attendant. I don't know how many times that's happened to you. I don't know how many times you've been at an event in black tie when someone thinks you're the waiter and asks you to bring them a drink. The number of times, which is a classic incident, when I was CEO of Aetna, we were traveling. It was a very important transaction. We were traveling by private plane. We go to the FBO, the flight center, and we get out of the car and there's a bus that's going to take us out to the plane. I'm going into the FBO. Next to me is a guy in shorts and with hat on backwards. And as I go into the FBO, the person at the front door says, "Where are you going?" And I say, "Well, to the restroom." And he looks at me and he says, "Well, the driver's restroom is around the side." And I ask him, "What makes you think I'm a driver?" I'm in a suit, a tie, and the guy next to me is in shorts with his hat on backwards. But somehow or another, you think I am a driver and not a person with a private plane.
See, these are the kind of stories that you just can't believe still happen, and I think are really important for people to hear, because if the people haven't experienced these kinds of things, it does point out that it's not the same, of course, as the death of an individual, but it shows some institutionalized perceptions, at least, if not worse, doesn't it, Ron? And
Well, it does.
We've got to get over this as a society, just plain and simple.
Well, I think just a couple of points, Steve, and I think to come back to the economic implications, the thing that's critical to me is that diversity and inclusion in America is a job half done. That if you look at the number of boards that still don't have a person of color on the board, it's an amazingly surprising number. And I think I shared some data with you on that fact. And what that means is in that boardroom, there isn't a dialogue about that. Even when boards do have members who are women, other members of groups, the board is not holding the CEOs accountable. I think what's different this time, based on the conversations I had, is that boards are going to hold CEOs accountable to implement the actions that they have actually talked about and are taking. And I think there's an opportunity for CEOs to be more involved in creating a fair and equitable society, so that the management team, the organization, is reflective of the customers that it serves.
So what really needs to happen now in our society? I mean, we're at a point, we've raised this awareness, we're at a crescendo. What would you like to see happen in order for us truly to make permanent progress towards a just society?
Well, I think companies have to recognize that they have to not only focus on their business in the context of profitability. And I think we saw this in the announcement that the Business Roundtable had recently, which recognized that stakeholders played a key role, not to the exclusion of shareholders, but in support of creating value for shareholders. What that means is that companies have to focus much more on increasing the availability. They have to get involved in the educational system in meaningful ways. They have to get more involved in issues of social justice. Companies are going to have to go back to what executives did 20 or 30 years ago, when companies, organizations like the Conference Board didn't just focus on their company, they focused on making society more equitable and more fair, which created opportunities for people like me.
You know, we both were CEOs at the same time, and I always struggled with what should be my role as a CEO. And I think you and I both agree that CEOs shouldn't just wander into politics aimlessly, but this is something different. I mean, this is really an important time for society, for business leaders to engage with political leaders in society, and also for employees. But what is the right balance here? What role should CEOs play? Because primarily, they have accountability to multiple constituents, certainly their owners, shareholders, and so forth, but also employees and their customers and broader society. So where's the balance, and what is the right role?
Well, I think companies have to be selective and target. You're absolutely right that the CEO can't be all things. But for example, in my case, as you recall, as a healthcare company, we focused very much on healthcare, and we focused on trying to make certain that there was increased insurance, increased availability of healthcare services, and that no one would go without health insurance. Now, we didn't accomplish everything we thought we would like to accomplish, but we significantly were active in making certain more people got insurance. So I think the answer is think about your industry, think about your employees. One thing, for example, I talked to a company about is more pro bono work. I was talking to a private equity group a few days ago. They have a collection of the smartest, most knowledgeable financial people around. and I asked, how much time do you spend helping women and minority-owned business improve their performance? Does anyone spend any time bringing that expertise into that community to help them do better? The answer was no. And imagine if across the private equity community or the financial community, that expertise was broadly shared with businesses that didn't have the benefit of that kind of expertise. So there's a lot employees can do, but employees need the permission of the company to know that's okay to do.
So you're making an important point. You're not saying that every CEO needs to stand up and, and because every CEO has different talents too. Every company has different focuses and so forth, but you're saying pick a lane, pick something that works strategically with the company, that works for the CEO, but do something here. Engage in some fashion that helps to move this along. Am I paraphrasing?
Yeah, I think that's true. The other point I would make is that a lot of this will be public-private partnerships. It won't just be the business alone. One of the things that we can do, I think most important, is to increase the business literacy of our young people, because they don't really understand how capitalism works, how American business works. And with summer coming up and with the constraints we have, there are going to be a lot of communities where young people are out of school, they don't have jobs, and there's an opportunity through public-private partnerships to try to use some of that time and intellectual capability to create job shadowing programs, educational programs through Zoom and other video content. I think there's a role for these kinds of public-private partnerships, but pick a lane, do what you can do, but most importantly, once you commit to do it, you really have to do it.
So, and what do you, Ron, you're so engaged in, in the private equity world, but also on some really important boards, public company boards in our country today. Can you give us any examples of what you're doing personally to help drive this conversation?
Well, I would say one of the things I'm involved with from a nonprofit perspective is something called the National Academy Foundation, NAF. We have over 110,000 high school students who enroll in academic academies in public schools, where the parents in the public school declare they want to be a finance academy, and a health academy, an information technology academy. And these high school students in their second, third, and fourth years take a curriculum oriented to that discipline, and historically they've had job shadowing, they've had internships. This is getting at the heart of increasing the availability. These are typically urban schools, rural high schools, and kids who really might not have an interest and an understanding of all of the opportunity are involved in that. So one of the things I've done was instrumental in getting the Health Sciences Academy started. There now are probably 25,000, 30,000 students getting broadly exposed to all of the activity. One of the CEOs of one of the boards I'm involved with took an interest in it. He's on that board and really supporting it. So I think the things that we can do as individuals and the things that companies can do is source and recruit talent, broadly speaking. Recruit from historically Black colleges, recruit from state universities, recruit from community colleges, work in the communities that you're in to try to bring more people into a place where they are able to participate. The one other point I would make is increase on-ramps. And what that means is that in many instances, companies want to hire someone who is exactly like the person who had the job last. That often excludes a lot of people, women, people of color, or people who have 85% of what you need, but not 100%. Yeah. When you build an on-ramp, you build a program and capability to fill that 15%. What you'll find is they will be some of your star performers, and they'll be much more loyal.
Yeah, these are great examples. And of course, you've been very involved in all of the conference boards work. This is some primary for us, engaging with business leaders around the country and around the world, and at that nexus of business and society. As a vice chairman of the conference board, you've been very, very, very involved, and thank you for that. Last question, Ron. Any advice that you have for a CEO who is not yet engaged, doesn't really know how to get started, but really wants to? What would you say to that person?
I think the most important thing that the CEO has to do is he has to build a board that's reflective of the broader society. Then he has to use that board's experience and expertise to structure the organization. He has to hold the organization accountable to be reflective at all levels of the broader society. Many organizations are very reflective at lower levels. They don't know how to develop and move people through the levels, and the CEO is often not the chief diversity officer of the company, which they really need to be. Diversity, not just in the sense of African Americans, but broadly speaking, and has to make certain that that company and its values are reflected in the workforce and its participation in our civil society.
Very well stated. Well, Ron, you have been a role model for decades in your companies and in society. We are so pleased that you are part of the conference board, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you, Steve. Pleasure to be here.